This is the Andrew Lake Podcast, and in this episode, I'm sharing with you my personal insights from a 100,000 word essay that I wrote on my life. So about a year ago, I did a self-authoring exercise. I didn't get an online course or any formal structure. I just took it upon myself to write out the story of my life in a Word document. I've done this before sort of as little summaries at different chapters in my life at different ages. And I've also done extensive journal work over the last 2 years. But this self-authoring exercise was sitting down to write out everything of significance that I could remember from my entire life, from the very beginning up until right now. I was also doing so much journaling and so much introspection on my life around this same time, about a year and a half ago, that the whole thing amassed to about 150,000 words. And I also did writing which was more condensed and more summarized. I even started to put together a little book which I thought I might release, but I'm still up in the air about and I'm not sure what I want to do with it. Writing has turned out to be much harder than I thought when presenting it to someone else. But just for my own exercise, writing without any restriction has been extremely paramount to my understanding of knowledge and my life and the nature of reality. So today I'm sharing the personal insights that I got from going through that process. It might seem like it's a really hard thing to write a 100,000 word essay. That's quite a large essay by most stretches of the imagination, but it really wasn't hard to do because, first of all, I had quite a bit of experience with introspection and getting my thoughts from the brain to the page, so it wasn't an entirely unfamiliar process to me. But also, I found that once I got into it, I sort of just got sucked into it and it carried me along. If I start from the very start of my life and really think about it and put myself into a scene, then I go into that world and then I have to explain more and more and more, and it sort of carries me into the next scene and then the next scene, and each thing opens up as the writing unfolds. Now, of course, straight up, you might say, well, how do you know your memory is reliable? How do you know if what you remember is true and it actually was the way you remembered it? And that's a very good point, and that's addressed in any self-authoring program. In fact, the whole point of self-authoring and self-discovery through narrative writing is testing this idea of your memories. And what I found was, as I went into these memories and thought about them, I reframed how I felt about them and how I spoke about them to myself. I also found that the memories opened up and became a lot more rich by really going into the details of what was it that was important about a significant event or a scene or an interaction with a person. And that was one of my first insights, is into the nature of memory and into the nature of what it means to hold on to an experience from the past and have a relationship with that hold, knowing that your memory will be distorted and that memory will come out in different ways every time you recall it, but still learning the relationship to memory as a skill in and of itself. So I'd like to read some of the opening lines from this, which was the premise of the writing that I wrote, or the idea of the mindset that I wrote going into the process. So allow me to read some straight up. The term shadow work often appears in the fields of psychology, therapy, and personal development. These are all fields that I am interested in, and I see this writing as a personal learning process. Shadow work is the process of bringing what you don't understand about yourself into awareness. It is also a way of breaking down how you understand the world and your place in it. Your shadow is the part of you that's misunderstood. Why you acted the way you did when in retrospect you could have done differently. Shadow work is integrating your flaws into your personality. There are numerous techniques that can be used for shadow work, one of which is journal writing. Now that I have been journal writing for a few months, I understand how this works on the practical level, and I have an experiential understanding of how it works. Every few days, you write what you are doing and feeling and thinking. At first glance, writing about your day is fine, but eventually that becomes boring. And if you keep writing and you keep at it, you'll end up writing about how you feel about the events in your life. You write about goals, fears, ideas, and things that go deep into who you think you are, how you relate to others, and your place in the world. It takes honesty within yourself, and one must write about the emotional times for the significant events in life to be clarified. Over the weeks and months, the stories build up and you start to see patterns in the flow of dialogue. You start to see what habits you have, what things lead to what feelings, how you relate to people, and how things are always changing. Ultimately, you get a deeper picture of how you feel about life. With the understanding of these things comes a greater ability to change what you do. Seeing through your own motivations is key to becoming more motivated, and more motivated for a meaningful cause. The person you are isn't a culmination of all that has been before. The deeper you get into the past, the more of an understanding you have of yourself. There is an experience that has been rumored to occur during deep journal writing. When the author describes an experience in detail, the event reoccurs in their mind as they are writing. I have had glimpses of this before and know that it requires a sensitivity to the subtlety of the exercise. On a few rare occasions, I have had intense emotional experiences recalling momentous events in my journal. It is reliving life and making sense of an experience after the fact. Furthermore, memories are never really what they seem. What happened and how I remember things to have happened are always going to have a difference between them. Where does the truth stand? I'll be as honest as I can from my perspective, and if I remember something and believe it with my heart of hearts, it may as well have been that way. Perhaps you will be able to see where I am lying to myself, and you will be able to tell me, and will thus learn something more about myself. Perhaps how much I write about some things and not about others will also be telling. I've found the tone of voice to be a significant indicator of how I feel about memories in my life. There is always going to be a barrier between what is meant and what is expressed. How things come out is only one side of how understanding is formed. But this is part of the process in writing about memories. My way of thinking about a scenario will be different to how I lived it. We all have experiences, and we all have one way of interpreting the significance and meaning of that experience at the time we are having it. With introspective, we can reinterpret the meaning of an experience and better understand why we felt and acted the way we did. In this regard, we are always in a relationship with ourselves. The question is, how do we develop that relationship? There is what happened, how I felt, what I was thinking, and the actions I took, and the relation of all these factors surrounding the event. How the descriptions come out is not entirely up to me, and how I choose to tell the story is another indicator of what is significant to me. Part of the learning process is understanding how expressions are formed. This is my tool of choice for self-discovery. I will be on a journey in my mind, and I am approaching it with the utmost sincerity. The more seriously you go about doing something, the more you get out of it. But then again, the less serious you are, the more you enjoy it. I don't know what I'll find on this journey, but I am open-minded and determined to make it a good one. I know this story is no different to anyone else's. There's nothing special about me, I'm not famous or rich, and I've done nothing of significance. I just want to know what the hell is going on in this life. Writing commences 29th of October 2017. So I wrote that as the opening premise for this exercise. As it turned out, that experience of recalling events and reliving them did actually happen to me. There were times during writing where I'd feel my body shaking, I'd feel my hands sweating, and depending on the event, I would have a physiological reaction to the thoughts in my mind. I even at points completely burst out into tears and broke down emotionally because of how clear it became in my mind to understand and re-enter into those events. And that was the first major insight that I had, which was that your thoughts have a powerful connection to your emotional feeling. And practicing that link and inquiring into the nature of that connection could lead to a stronger ability to navigate those two things. The more detail I went into with each scene, the more powerful the emotional effect was. Of course, also the significance of the event. So it has to be an event which is already quite powerful, and I have to write it in a way which is quite detailed. So I would describe the events coming into the event, the lead up to it. I would do descriptive words of the situation. I would also talk about the other people that are involved. I would also talk about the thoughts that were going on in my head at the time as best that I can remember. And then I'd go through the process of unfolding the events as a narrative. And I'd also talk about the feelings that I had, especially during the peak. So once the set and the setting and the premise was all set, I could talk about the feeling of the peak, and that was what would bring on these emotional experiences. And doing all that in one sitting, so actually sitting down at the desk and typing it out in a continuous strand uninterrupted, was what led to the greatest results of emotional experience. Another major insight that I had as I was doing this was that I could go to very far out places in my mind and yet then still come straight back to everyday life. So I would be writing these intense passages about my childhood years and years ago where people were completely forgotten, completely gone, and the whole place had been out of my mind for years upon years. And I would write about these situations and get really deep into them. And then I'd put on my work uniform and go across to work and have a completely normal life and completely normal day. So putting the far out memories into a clear experience and then putting that right next to my everyday life helped me bridge the difference between my memories having weight upon my normal life. Half our problem is not just remembering situations, but it's remembering to remember situations. So that would be knowing the significance of a memory and being able to draw that up in our minds at different times. And this is especially important for gratitude because it's in certain situations that are stressful that we don't remember where we've been before. We don't remember the goodness that we've had, the luck that we've had, the experiences that we are grateful for. And we've all had moments where we've seen, in contrast to others, that our lives are actually pretty good. If you dig deep enough, you see that there are a lot of people that have got it worse by a long shot. So why is it that we don't remember that more often? Why is it that we don't have a obvious enough contrast between ourselves and other people's lives that we can carry that gratitude into our day-to-day life? Another one of the fundamental insights that I had from doing this process was just how many different things I have been. So this one is hard to convey just in a few words, but there have been certain points where I have thought that I have been so many different things. As in, what I am is completely different at different times in my life. And there are a number of different ways we can slice this. For example, where I'm living. So I've lived in quite a few different places, and they all had their own vibe, their own energy, or whatever you want to call it. But when I was in that situation, when I was in that living condition, I also had a way of thinking and a way of feeling that was completely different to any other way of living. And when we move houses, we move cities, or we take up different residencies, we tend to sort of feel a transition, a graduality to how we change and adjust to the new environment. But by writing about it and making memories explicit and comparing different memories, it was clear as day to me that I had been living under totally different ways of thought at different times in my life. I'd also been in connection with different types of people, different kinds of people. So family life is very different to out-of-home life and adult life. And circles of friends change, and depending on what activities you're involved in, depending on where you're living, and depending on what your focus is in life, your circle of friends has a big influence on how you feel and how you think about life in general. And it's quite shocking to think about how many friends I've had which I've never spoken to again. I've completely lost track with. And it doesn't just go for friends, it also goes for acquaintances and people that are in the area. So this insight was leading on to not just the number of different things that I've been, but this is more to do with the relations that I have with people. And this is about what it means to act on a day-to-day situation with the understanding that it won't always be like this. Things are going to change, and there's a good chance that you will completely lose touch and completely lose contact with your situation that you are in now. Doesn't even mean that you are moving cities. It might mean that you are changing circle friends or people are coming in and out of your life. You also have changing goals, changing values. So the transitional nature of the narrative of life sort of hides this fact that we have been different things at different times in life. And just my ideal goals as well have changed quite a lot. So I wanted to be a pro BMX rider as a kid, and I was so sure of it. I was so passionate about it. I loved watching Dave Mirra and Matt Hoffman and those incredible vert ramp BMX stars like Jamie Bestwick and Jay Mirren and Van Homan and TJ Lavin. These guys were the idols to me. These were what I wanted to do. These were the things that I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing. And that was BMX riding. That was this one hobby. There've been a number of different times when my life has changed interests and my ideals have, well, if you look at them now, it's just a complete explosion into flowering complexity and wow, man. That's, well, like I'm getting a sense of it just now because I can see that ideal and what it was like to be a kid with that ideal, and I can compare it to right now. Like right now, my mind is just buzzing and popping with the comparison because I have strengthened the understanding that when I was 12 years old, I wanted to be a pro BMX rider. And I've also got the understanding that that's an ideal that I'm working towards. And I've also got the understanding that the comparison of ideals is key to understanding how many different things I have been. And that gives me a great gratitude for right now. Like what I've got now, the ideals, or rather more, in a more nuanced way, my relationship to ideals is very different to back then. And I'm so grateful for having that understanding. So the other component of self-authoring is not just past authoring, but future authoring. And I didn't do too much of this. I really focused on the past authoring. But with this insight about how many different things I have been, came the additional insight, which was how many more things I am going to be. Considering that I'm not really that old, I would by no stretch of the imagination call myself an old man on the decline, and having this relationship to approaching what might be an illusionary peak of existence or peak of ability is a separate issue. But knowing that I've been lots of things and I'm going to be so much more really just brought down to earth this gratitude of how many different experiences I've been able to have throughout life. Another insight that came from writing this essay was learning about how to deal with narrative. So a lot of the writing at first was narrative, which is in the who, when, where, what, why writing. But as in journal writing, when you do the narrative for so long, you also have a reflection on the narrative. You also have a summary feeling about the narrative. And then there's also a summary of the summary. And the thing starts to snowball into your everyday experience and your everyday summary of what life is. So we can say, what is life? Or what is your life like? Or what are some of the things you've done with life? And you can come up with quick answers, but by writing out the details within those quick answers, it strengthens your picture that comes to mind when you use summaries. So the ability to summarize a feeling about a complex series of events is strengthened by going into the details and strengthening the memories and the details. Another powerful insight, which has come to me actually quite recently when contemplating over this process, was that significance and meaning is nested in context. So this is an academic insight which can easily be thrown to someone and understood intellectually, that meaning exists within context, which means basically that you don't know what a word means unless there's other words surrounding it, and you don't know what a concept is unless it's contrasted and explained in a certain way. But this I learnt from my own experiences, my own stories, and my own events in my life. So the things that I found really powerful and the events that really stayed in my mind, or the emotional events, were emotional because I was wired in a certain way to be ready to have those feelings. Now, they weren't all positive, some of them were very negative. But by doing the authoring process, I could see how one event led to another. And digging into this cause and effect process of the narrative really helps to pinpoint why it is that I felt the way I did. And the key insight is that the things I find significant now are significant because of the wirings that I have within me. They're significant because of the context of things that I have. And also, the significance will change. So we have this idea that things are great. This is a really good thing. This is an amazing thing. This is what I'm passionate about. And this is similar to the ideal, but on a more smaller level, it's the experiences of the moving towards the ideal. But this paradigm, this approach, this attitude to the ideal is something that can be understood, picked apart, and intellectualized so that you can know why it is that certain things are significant. And this really gets at the core of the mechanics of meaning. So try to understand the significance of this. If you want something to be meaningful, you can understand why things are meaningful and then put those whys onto other things. You are literally reverse engineering your ability to have a meaningful experience. But you've got to do this narrative process. You've got to do this writing process, which is asking yourself, why was that meaningful? How do I explain to someone the drama of an event when they don't even know what it means to be a part of that event? So I was involved in various different subcultures, and I don't really know who I was writing to, but at least part of me felt like I had to explain certain things about my life to an audience which wouldn't understand them otherwise. Doing that really got me to think about why it is that I experienced things in a certain way and why events were significant in a certain way. Another insight that came from doing this writing process was the insight of feeling like it was pointless. And this seems to be in contrast to what I've just been saying about meaning and significance. But it's not a contradiction, because you get to a certain point where telling your story and writing about your story becomes an insignificant thing, and certain events become irrelevant. So there's a polarization between complexifying and intensifying your memories on one hand, and on the other hand, just forgetting about them and moving them on. So I felt like as I wrote about certain events in my life and they became more solid and more real, I could easily forget about them and leave them aside with much more skill and dexterity than as if I hadn't have written about them. So it was like an integration and an ability to adapt to memory that arose, which included the ability to forget about them. So we could say that the ability to remember something needs to be understood in what it's like to forget something. If something is clear in your mind, it's a non-issue. If it's an event that you can articulate quite easily and summarize quite easily, then it doesn't come back to bug you. It doesn't come back to haunt you. The other thing about forgetting memories and moving on from memories is that I realize there's a limit to this process. So yes, we need to introspect and look back on our past, but you also do need to live life. You do need to create experiences. So self-authoring is just one step in a process. It's just one exercise that you do. I think it took me about 3 to 4 months to write this 100,000 word essay. So that was with full-time work. So it was a very encompassing, encroaching on me, obsessive sort of process. And that was actually another one of these insights that I had, which was that a lot of what I do in life is done with a huge amount of passion and a lot of obsession. And I don't know if that's a good thing. It definitely makes for a high degree of productivity and action and doing, but at least now I'm starting to recognize that when I get a hold of something or something gets a hold of me, I really play it out with a lot of steam and a lot of fire. The short amount of time in which I wrote this whole thing was an indication of that. What's going to be interesting is how will I feel about reading this essay a few years, 10 years, 20 years down the track. And I'm sure I'm going to think that it's absolute rubbish, absolute garbage. But at least that will tell me something. That in and of itself will tell me something. And knowing again and again that my story is changing and how I feel about my story will only lead to more of an understanding of what it means to have a story and to live a story. It's definitely a worthwhile experience. It's definitely something that I would recommend to anyone. And this goes for anyone, even if you don't think that you've got a significant life or a meaningful life. It is significant and it is meaningful because it happened to you. And you can write about all sorts of things, even the mundane things. If you think hard enough about it, there have been certain things in your life that you remember. There have been certain points, certain days, certain events, situations that do stick out to you. And it's those that define us. And it is possible to go in to say, well, why do they define them? Why do they define me? And what can I do to have more of these events? What can I do to set up my life for the future to have more meaning? So I'd like to read the closing remarks of what I wrote. And some of this won't make sense because it refers a lot to the material, but I think I'd like to read it anyhow and see if you can make sense of what's changed from the beginning to the end. The BBC trio still blows my mind after all these years of listening to their music. There are numerous albums by Keith Jarrett that have had the same effect. Staggering considering that some of these albums I've been listening to consistently for over 10 years. Music is just one method of peak experiences, and since I've started experimenting with meditation, these experiences have grown deeper. Recognizing you're chasing a feeling changes the nature of the game. I hope I don't come across as smug or like I know it all, because on the contrary, the more you know, the more ignorant you become. I think I've explained that well enough. I've learnt that mysticism is a big part of my life, and there has been a hint of the ethereal in everything that I've done. I've found a path to walk and recognize this is just an analogy. Existential understanding is just one part of the whole, but it is essential to all things. I'm glad it's possible to change and learn. I'm glad the answers are out there. When I'm living a story, what's happening feels significant. After the fact, things fade and only the important things remain. Perhaps in the long run, everything will fade. This is not a subtle form of nihilism, but rather a reason to feel content and fulfilled right now. What's changed since I wrote this essay? On the one hand, not much. On the other hand, everything. Change is gradual, and change has direction. Personal development must be practiced consistently and diligently. People are rarely born again in an instant, but the illusion does have its utility in the process of learning. I still struggle with addiction, and I must be disciplined to not let my bad habits become hedonistic or impulsive. I can trust the better part of me is going to grow and outdo my lower self. Submission, paradox, and openness are key to the learning process. It's interesting to note how little material possessions appear in my story. It's more about what happened, how I felt, what I did and what I thought. Where are all these memories now? Where are all these stories that I associate myself with? They are only in my head. This writing has not meant to be a way for me to solidify my ego and sense of self. It was meant to show that my story cannot tell me who I am. To be nobody is the greatest freedom. To be nobody, we must first get over ourselves. All that I've got now has come from everything that came before. Perhaps the deepest realization I can have is that I am an expression of the cosmic spirit. I am part of everything. I feel deep gratitude for having such a thought, and I'm glad this thought has been given to me. I can only imagine what thoughts I haven't had, and how many more will come to me. I can't imagine how different someone else's story would be. The intrapersonal is yet another avenue I feel inadequate to navigate. At least I know how to go about learning the skills required. At least I know it's possible to improve in all areas, including my relationships. I'd like to read your life story. I'd like to see how you think and feel. What were the significant events in your life? I'd encourage anyone to write a journal like this. But how do I make such a suggestion in a way that will inspire action? Perhaps if you've read this or heard about this, you'll be more moved to do something similar. My life advice is simple. Get smart and take care of yourself. But we know it's a bit more complicated than that. This is why we must take the time and energy to do things like reflect on our lives. This is why we have to read books and listen to others talk. I've always been very passionate. Feelings have been both a destructive and a guiding force in my life. I've always defined myself in relation to another, not only by what others say, but by comparing what I think of myself to how I conceptualize others. I can see through this game at times and see that I am nothing. It's hard to clarify memories and put them into chronological order, and writing like this has helped. Putting words on things forces you to identify your beliefs and values. What are my core values? I'm not entirely sure what my core values are, but I can tell you what values I'd like to uphold. Things like beauty, love, revelation, truth, contemplation, and peak experiences. How do I have more of these things in my life? How do I give those things to others? I believe I can learn and grow. I believe things are like reasons. They are a bottomless pit. What action should I take now? What thoughts should I have now? For one thing, I'm going to allow myself to think more. I've had too much of an emphasis on action and doing in my life. I also need to develop a stronger understanding of how destructive the low path is. I need to realize the risk of falling back down to the low path. It is always there, just like a step away from the high path. I need to commit to my routine and cut out all the dumb shit that I do. And yes, I still struggle with these things. Even now I can hear my dominance complex talking. It's one thing to develop a multidimensional mind. How about becoming a multidimensional being? Clarity of life is the most beautiful thing I have ever known. I can feel it whispering just beyond the edge of my next thought. I can feel it playfully teasing me before it pulls me into a peaceful rest. It happens anywhere and any time. When it happens, it will be right now, because all we ever have is right now. If you ask me now if I believe in God, I would say yes, but it's not the same God you are thinking about when you ask. How I think about God is just one expression of my spiritual intelligence, which is just one line of intelligence out of many. These lines have had their levels and their systems of values, and they are all experienced by ever-evolving, ever-changing expression of the one spirit that is in everything. So, even since I wrote all that last year, a lot has changed, and I wouldn't even agree with all those things. So, for example, the idea of clarity of mind, this is just one small concept to me now, even though back then I said it's the most beautiful thing I have ever known. I also mentioned God, and I'd probably stay away from God because there's just too much confusion around it. There's too much misunderstanding around it. To someone who has an integral way of conceptualizing reality, God is a tool, it's a system, it's just one part of the mechanism of spiritual intelligence. So how I answer this question, do you believe in God, is a complicated one in and of itself, but really, there's no man in the clouds, so don't get the impression that I believe in God. It's more complicated than that. I don't think I really want to go into that. That's a conversation for another day. Another thing that's shocking to read is that this idea of the low path. So I was so obsessed with the low path and overcoming my addictions, and my personal story is a story of overcoming addiction. And I have had hard addictions like drinking and smoking. So that's only part of it, but now it seems so laughable. It seems so funny that I even then thought it was a big thing. So it's a complete non-issue now. So that just shows how even since doing this writing, things have changed and progressed. And another thing, the whole idea of changing and progressing and learning, that's just one paradigm. And it's really in contradiction to the being and experiencing paradigm. The idea that you have to change, you have to improve, is only relevant at certain points. And I don't want to downplay the importance of personal development, but like all paradigms and all processes and mechanisms, they become smaller and moved out of awareness as your paradigm expands and as you come into new information. Or to be more accurate, they don't become pushed out, they become integrated so you can still use them, you can still have them, you can still draw on them as a skill, but they don't take up the bulk of your vision. They're not in the forefront of your sight, they're on the peripheries. So the thing that is right in front of your face and takes up the most amount of space in your awareness will later become small and distant and insignificant. I feel like I could keep talking about this all day, and I could share all sorts of funny stories from my life. But I just thought I'd share some of these insights to show what it's like to write about your life as a philosophical process or a personal development introspective process, to maybe spark some ideas in you, see if it's something you might like to try. It's my personal testimony. I feel obviously very personal about it. It's very touchy to me because it is me. But it's also interesting to note that I've really gone so much further beyond that, and I don't really care much about these memories. I can really let go of them. Thanks very much for tuning in. I hope you're having a wonderful day. It's beautiful weather out there at the moment where I am, so I'm going to go and enjoy that. And we'll be back soon with more.
This world goes over my head. I can't keep up with what's being said.